Hey guys, so we've gotten a lot of comments and feedback in our videos, and a lot of our coaches and just people out there want to know what are the differences between the AssaultRower and the C2 rower. So I want to give you guys some general thoughts, and this is based on 6 months of using this thing a lot in training and in testing. So I want to walk through some general thoughts. I want to walk through the setup and the differences of this rower versus the C2. I want to walk through some differences in metabolic implications relative to this and the C2 rower. And I also want to walk through the metrics and what this thing shows us and not, based on differences between this and the other machine, the C2. So first, it's obviously an extremely beefy machine. This thing is huge relative to the C2 rower. So if space is an issue, this might be a problem for you because this takes up a decent amount of square footage and it's not that easy to manipulate and move around. But I think that also makes it a good thing because it's very sturdy. So relative to the C2, this thing just moves around a lot less and it just feels a lot more sturdy. And like I said, it's just a beefier machine that is clearly meant for commercial use. So I've actually been using this thing in my garage and in my backyard. I haven't had many issues, but there have been some times where I wished it was just a little bit lighter or a little bit easier to flip upside down. It's also very, very comfortable. So the seat is nice and soft. So if you're doing like a 10K row on this thing, the butt fatigue doesn't become a limiter like it does on other rowing machines. And also it just looks really good. I think the aesthetics of this thing is a lot better than the C2 rower, and I think a lot of that is just based on it just looks more high-end. In terms of setup of the AirRower, there's nothing nuanced about the seat slide, so it's very similar to what you would see in other ergs, especially the C2, but like I did say, it is a lot more comfortable. Something to notice that I think is a great feature on this rower is that the seat actually locks in. So you'll see you have this little red dial here, and there's a hole back here. So you kind of push it back, you lock it in, and then when you go to pick this thing up to put it upright, that seat doesn't slide all over the place. So I really like that feature. Also, just to point out the oar itself, this thing is beefy just like the rower, so it's very thick, but it's comfortable in your hands. I've had some people with small hands use this, and they didn't really notice that much of a difference, but it was N equals like 1 or 2. So I think over time, with a lot of people with smaller hands using this, I think they'll have some forearm limitations if they're longer pieces. But the setup of the oar it's good. I like that it's a little more sturdy than the C2 rower, but people with smaller hands may not like that. Another thing that's important to note is that the chain sits about 1 inch or 1.5 inches higher than the C2. So this could be good or bad depending on who you are. So where this can be good is it actually keeps you in a nice upright position, and it's very hard to get out of position on this rower. So it almost self-corrects the issue of the chain hitting the bottom and you having to tell your client to keep the chain within 1 inch of each other, because this self-corrects for that and you can't actually do that here. The screen is not adjustable. So you can adjust just the end up and down, but you can't adjust the bar itself like you can on the C2. So this could be annoying if you're putting it away and it's close to a wall and you just want to put that screen down, or you want to put that screen back so you can get it a little bit closer to the wall. So just think about this, and this thing isn't adjustable. Another thing that I don't understand why we aren't doing quite yet is why we don't have a bigger screen, kind of like an iPad or something similar to that. You're still kind of squinting to see where you're at. It's almost the same in aesthetics and looks as the C2, but I think this thing would be a lot better if it was a larger digital screen. And I understand that would make it a much more expensive machine, but I think that there's a market out there for something like that. In terms of the seat height, you'll notice that the seat height is a couple inches higher than the C2. Why is this relevant? For people in functional fitness that do exercises like burpees over the erg, this is actually going to be harder to do a burpee over this erg because you're increasing your jump height by about 2 inches. Relative to the base of the machine, like I said earlier, it just feels more sturdy, and that's because the base is actually wider. So when you actually get going on this thing and you're pulling as hard as you can, you don't feel the wobble like you do on the C2 rower. You feel like the rower is here, it's not going anywhere. You don't need to put it like a kettlebell on the back so you're not sliding all over the place. The rower can withstand a lot of power. All right, now let's talk about the metabolic implications of the Assault AirRower versus C2. So one thing that's really important to note is that we don't have a damper setting on the side. So there's just one setting and there's one drag relative to this rower. So that can be good, but that can be bad in the same instance. If you just think about the Assault bike, for instance, that doesn't have a damper setting. You can't make that harder or easier. It is what it is. And Assault took that same approach with the rower. So what does that mean? It means that everyone's doing the same thing, right? It's like the resistance that's in the chain is going to be the same for every single person. So we don't have the ability to go down to a low damper if it's a longer piece, or a higher damper if we want to put out a lot of power and it's a more, let's call it a quicker piece, and you're 15, 20 seconds and out. So I do think it would be beneficial if we did have the ability to adjust based on what we're doing in that session. But where this is going to hurt some people is that they're not going to be able to keep up with the high drag. And when we start to look at where clients are on a novice to advanced scale, I would say that the novice clients are going to have more issues on this erg than the C2 rower. Because once we start to see novice clients get out of position and muscle endurance, especially in the back, where that starts to become a limiter, we can't just walk to the rower and put the damper down to kind of self-correct that. They would have to correct it. So over longer periods of time, that would be a downfall for a more novice client. What's better about this is it's actually easier to find your pace. So let's say that you prescribe 2 minutes per 500 meters. Your client's going to be able to find that 2 minutes a little bit easier. But like I said, if they're holding that for 30 minutes, it's going to be a little bit tougher to keep that because the drag factor may be a little bit tougher for your client. Empirical data. So like I said, I've done a lot of training on this, but I've also done 2 very important tests here at Opex. So I did the 30-30 row times 4 on this, and I compared it to my C2 scores. And I was actually about the same. Like I was plus or minus 5 meters across the board. I may have been more fit back then or less fit when I did it on the C2 rower. I don't know, but it was in the ballpark. I didn't see any major differences. But then I tested the 60-minute row, which no one really wants to test a bunch of times. So I only did that once on this thing. And I was 8 to 10% lower in meters on this than I was on the C2. But to give you context, when I go a 60-minute row on the C2 rower, I'm at about a 3.5 damper. On this, I didn't have the ability to change that. So limitations for me on the C2 rower are breathing and butt muscle endurance to actually sit on that hard seat for 60 minutes. Limiter here was upper body pulling muscle endurance. Even for me, where I've been pulling for a very long period of time, so I wouldn't say that that's a massive limiter for me in any aerobic setting, but it actually came to show in about minute 40 here. So on the C2 rower, I was close to 16,000 calories. On this, I barely hit 15,000 calories. So there is a little bit of difference there. I may be a little bit less fit than I am now, but just the feeling in that was obviously noticeable. As far as metrics and the tracking of those metrics on the Assault rower, there's a lot of things that I really like about this machine, and there's a couple things that I don't like. So first, let's talk about the things that I like. So I like that there's incremental increases in calories. So what I mean by that is if you have a client and you say, row 20 calories, go do that, go do this, instead of saying, 1, 2, 3, 4, and they don't know how close they are to the next calorie, you get incremental increases. So it's 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, all the way to 2. So you know where you're at inside of that calorie. So I really like that. Another thing that I like about the metric tracking on the Assault rower is that you can see meters and calories on the same screen. So that's extremely beneficial, especially when we're trying to teach clients to understand, if you hold this pace, you will, obviously relative to that pace, you'll go this far in distance, but they can also take a peek down at calories. If they have a 4 calories piece tomorrow, they can kind of connect the dots there. So I think that is really beneficial. Some things that I don't like about this is that I can't see cals per hour, which is, it's tough to actually see what your pace is relative to calories. So on this machine, you're looking at calories and you have to correlate that to pace per 500 meters, which is okay, but I would rather see cals per hour like the C2 lays out. Another thing that I don't like about the metric tracking system here is that intervals are just a bit tough to set up. Very similar to the Assault bike, it's very manual. Like if I wanted to do intervals and I was going 15 or 20-minute intervals, I have to hold the arrow and it takes quite some time to actually get to 20 minutes. And there's not a lot of customization within the intervals. You can do custom intervals, but they're a little bit tough to get to where you want to go. You can do Tabata, all of the normal stuff that's on the Assault bike. But I wish that there was that I had the ability to customize those intervals a little more effectively. To wrap it up, I really like this rower, and I will probably always have one of these over the C2, but I think they're just two different machines. So if it may be possible, or I may consider to actually grab a C2 and have an Assault rower, because I look at these things as two different aerobic implements, just because of the differences in feel. And when we look at aerobic implements and putting those inside of our own or our client's program design, it's always good to have variety in terms of dose response on aerobic implements. So I like this more than the C2 rower, but I could see myself in the future having one of these as well as the C2 rower and just kind of mixing it up a little bit. It's almost like having one of these in an Assault bike or one of these in a Versa Climber. I kind of just look at it as they're two separate things. So if cost isn't an issue, which this is, I think it's about $400 or $500 more than a C2 rower. If cost isn't an issue, I would opt for this rower. If cost is an issue, I would just opt for the C2 if you're trying to be more cost effective. And then as well as, and this is a consideration that we have to think about, if we compete in fitness, this machine isn't used in competition yet. So if you're competing in fitness, you should not only have this, you should either have this and the C2 rower or just the C2 rower, because right now C2 is used in competition. And those are my thoughts on the Assault Air Rower.